Welcome to BIV Today, the daily podcast from the newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. There's a very interesting new report from Deloitte, the global professional services firm for the LGBT plus Chamber of Commerce in Canada. And it examines LGBT plus owned businesses. It's being shared this week at the Chamber's annual meeting, and it finds barriers to success are largely due to discrimination. That there are some really startling statistics in the report that we're going to discuss today, among other things, with the CEO and the co-founder of Canada's LGBT plus Chamber of Commerce, Darrell Schuurman, who has an extensive leadership background in the tourism and in transportation industries. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, look, it's 2021, but many of these reports' findings felt like a much earlier era. Let's start by talking about, what didn't surprise you in it.
And that's a really good question, because I think immediately you go to those areas that do surprise you. I think what didn't surprise me was the size and the size of the community, of the business community, and the economic impact of the community to some degree. This study showed that there's over 100,000 LGBT plus entrepreneurs and businesses across the country. And I think that for many, that is surprising. This is our second national landscape study that we've done. And in our previous study, that number was substantially lower. And we knew that was wrong. We knew anecdotally, when we look at data coming out of the US and just kind of proportionally based on the size of the LGBT community in general, we knew those numbers previously were underestimated. And you mentioned, at the opening here around discrimination, and we realized that many LGBT entrepreneurs are still hesitant to self-identify, and I think that was part of the reason why previously, those numbers were a little lower than estimated. So I'm happy to see that this study better aligns with where we felt the number of businesses sits, and then the economic impact. I think that we kind of pegged it at around $22 billion. This number is a little bit lower, well, quite a bit lower, but I think still that we know that at the end of the day, the economic impact that our businesses are having on the Canadian economy is significant and can't be overlooked.
Yeah, so then let's get to, I think, what is sort of the more problematic side of the findings, which is really that owners feel, first of all, reluctant to identify their identities. They feel hindered. They feel like it's cost them business. Expand upon that a little bit and help us understand the extent of that.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, when these numbers are very startling and unfortunate, and so I'll throw some stats out there. We know that from this research that 1 in 3 have, on at least one occasion, have purposely hidden the fact that they have LGBT ownership. So here already, 1 in 3.
Not just purposely, right? Like not just not meant to, but purposely hid.
They've purposely hidden the fact that they have LGBT ownership. And I think it goes to this next point where it's 1 in 3 have actually faced discrimination in the past because of LGBT ownership. So it makes sense that if you've actually experienced discrimination, that you're going to be more hesitant than to self-identify or to be actually out and identify.
And can you help me understand, like, when you're talking about discrimination, is it hostility? Is it just like you can't get a loan, you can't get the right place to situate your business, your supply chain is off kilter? What is it that you can say here is the consequence of this discrimination?
Yeah, and I think that, and that's a really good question. And I think that there's a lot of different elements that could be packed into that, because I think discrimination to everybody can have different meanings, obviously.
Yeah.
One of the things that we know, and you touched on it, was that we found that 1 in 4 have stated that they've actually lost contracts because of LGBT ownership. So obviously, that's a piece of the discrimination, is the actual loss of contracts because of LGBT ownership. But you touched on some of the other elements in terms of accessing capital, inability to acquire suppliers, accessing mentorship. So all of these pieces, as soon as these are barriers that they're facing, and that ties very closely into that fear of discrimination. So kind of whatever area it is, how they're interpreting this to be discrimination based on the fact that they identify as LGBT plus.
And yet, I would have to think that the majority of these businesses that are being identified as ownership in the LGBT plus community would be in major cities, where I might be wrong, but I would assume that they are the ones that have the greatest sense of tolerance, acceptance, integration, programming, all these types of things that really have taken away a lot of the earlier forms of discrimination that we experienced in our time, and yet it sounds like they're still trapped in this old era.
So I think there's a few things. So first of all, this was a national study, and so absolutely the bulk of LGBT plus businesses do tend to center in kind of those 3 larger urban centers. But we do have LGBT plus businesses across the country in all areas, not just our larger urban centers. So I think that we do tend to see a little bit higher propensity for feelings of discrimination from some of the more rural or non-larger urban centers. But even in the larger urban centers, it's I think sometimes we live in this bubble where we think that we have progressive laws and rights, but we're still dealing with people that have perhaps different perspectives and different attitudes. And when we start to look at, when it comes to procurement, when we're talking about loss of contracts and procurement, a business might be residing in one of the larger urban centers, but perhaps the purchaser that they're dealing with from this company may not be necessarily in that same city, or may not even be in Canada, right? So you may be dealing with purchasers that are from whose experiences and backgrounds and thoughts may not necessarily be as progressive and inclusive as what we tend to think is kind of the general landscape here in Canada.
So you mentioned a figure earlier about the scope of, if you want to call it, this ownership community, and what the composition of the business, or what it comprises. Can you put a number, or something close to a number, on what you think the cost is of this discrimination in terms of, say, economic activity among this ownership?
That's, what, we don't have that number yet, but that is something that we're working on. So this, as you pointed out at the start here, this research that has come out from Deloitte is very new. It's brand new here. And so we're still kind of digesting it. And I think that that's certainly a big impact, or a big consideration that we want to kind of delve into, is what is the financial implication of this. I think that there's been other studies done showing, not necessarily focused on entrepreneurs, but around LGBT inclusion in general, when we're talking around employees and having inclusive workplaces. And we know that there's significant financial implications because of employees not feeling included within the workplace. So, you're right. We need to kind of put some dollars to what this impact is from an entrepreneurial side. But if we again, if we're hearing that a quarter of businesses have faced the loss of contracts, that's a significant financial impact, not only for the LGBT community, but for our local and provincial and national economies. We have to keep in mind that LGBT plus businesses, they're creating employment, they're paying taxes, and so when they're having challenges and barriers to growing their business, that hurts us all.
Yeah. I wonder, I don't want to get into a generalized answer here. I always fear what those can be. However, if I were to take a look at say, an LGBT plus business owner, my assumption would be that person has experienced challenges with identity in communities growing up. So, okay, that part. But do they actually? Is there like another layer of apprehension or fear or reticence or hesitance in starting a business? Is it still at that space where an owner or a prospective owner would say, I know that if I start this business, I'm going to have yet another wave of issues to deal with here?
It's interesting if you kind of go back not far in history, sadly. It was although it was 1969 when same-sex relationships was decriminalized, but there still continued to face LGBT people in general continue to face discrimination, and it wasn't in the Human Rights Act didn't include LGBT individuals until I'll get my dates wrong here, but into the late 90s. And so a lot of LGBT people were still facing kind of this discrimination in their workplace. The federal government, they could be fired for being gay if they were in the military up until 1997. And so what we saw kind of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, a lot of LGBT people felt that they didn't want to continue to be in a traditional workforce where they face discrimination, could potentially be fired for being LGBT. So what we saw, and this is some of the historical research that we've been looking at, is a lot of LGBT individuals decided, well, entrepreneurship is a way that I can kind of at least take a little bit more control over that. So I didn't necessarily, if I start my own business, I don't have to worry about being fired. But to your point, then it's unfortunately the same challenges, is that they may not have to worry about being fired, but they have to worry about, do I promote myself as an LGBT entrepreneur or LGBT plus owned business for fear of the same thing, loss of contracts and your clients. And so I think, again, we progressed a lot since then, but we progressed a lot since then, but this data still shows that we still got some ways to go.
Yeah. Is it Darrell, though, also the case that there is obviously also a real asset, and there's no question that businesses will sometimes actually very proudly identify themselves as being owned in the community, and essentially try to draw upon others in the community for their customer base. But do you worry that these findings kind of suggest that we're still not at the point where there's a full and complete economic integration here, that there's some segregation of customer forces and supplier forces and things like that?
It goes to show that we still have a ways to go. And I think that to your comment, early on we saw LGBT businesses realizing that there was value for them to connect to do business with each other, but also to act as support mechanisms for each other. And so here in Canada, we started to see the formalization of LGBT plus chambers of commerce or business associations at the local level to really kind of help support that. You know, again, it's creating that network of like-minded, or I shouldn't even say like-minded businesses, but businesses that have a shared and common connection, at least with one element, right?
And a shared and common set of challenges, right?
Exactly, and shared experiences, right? So here's, you're creating that network, and at the same time, what they're looking to do is do business with each other. So if you're looking for an accountant, well, you know, I'm going to look, see if I can support, you know, another LGBT accountant or caterer or whatever it is. And so I think that's where you started to see the LGBT business community start to kind of really kind of work closely together. But I think you fast forward to today, there's a need to be beyond that. You know, how do we make sure that, you know, at the corporate level, at the government level, that when we start to look at procurement, that we're not just going to the same suppliers that we've always been using. How do we make sure that our supplier base is diverse, and that includes LGBT suppliers? And so that's where we're at, I'd say today, is like changing that mindset, you know, at the larger institutions, you know, starting to get corporations and starting to get governments at all levels to think about the importance of of the diversity of suppliers. And, you know, we're getting there. You know, we, as you mentioned, you know, we're hosting our annual summit this week, and many of our corporate partners are with us because they understand the value of using and engaging with diverse suppliers. They know that having LGBT suppliers or women-owned suppliers or Indigenous-owned suppliers or Black-owned suppliers brings different perspectives, brings innovation to the products and services that they're providing. And so that's what we need to get more and more companies of all sizes, not just corporations, but of all sizes, to realize that, you know, there's a business reason why you want to be engaging with diverse businesses and LGBT businesses in particular.
You know, so the other diversity conversations, inclusivity conversations that we're having in our country are somewhat of a help here, right?
Yeah, you know, absolutely. I think what we've seen is with the, you know, unfortunate incidences that started last summer with George Floyd, and have continued through the so not only the anti-Black racism, but the anti-Asian hate and the Indigenous injustices that are happening. What I think that's doing is it's helping. I shouldn't say helping is maybe the wrong word, but it's raising the awareness of the importance of a more inclusive world, and business plays such an important piece of creating that, of helping to create that inclusive and equitable world.
Yeah, I mean, no question, you know, with so many conversations taking place, we're bound to raise awareness. We're bound to maybe have attitudes progress in all of this. But when I looked at this report, I had trouble trying to identify really strong prescriptions. Is it simply just a matter of time, of, you know, the accretion of awareness that kind of works for this, or are there things that you think are a lot more potent as prescriptions at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're in a world now where I think we want immediate gratification, and everything we want faster and faster, right? And so I think time certainly, you know, is one, but I think, in my opinion, this is where we need corporate Canada, we need governments to really step up and say, like, this is important. We need to be making sure that all of our practices and policies are inclusive. And when we start to look at, again, as I mentioned, procurement policies and practices, really looking at the impact that we can have in all areas of business, and what happens when the social benefit that derives from making sure that our LGBT-owned businesses are part of the economic landscape. We realize that will help to continue to drive this forward. So, I think that the more that we can get corporate Canada and governments to really get behind this and to help to put some, I guess, to put some attention to this, I think is one of the ways that we can kind of move this faster.
Is there any basic institutional or legal impediment that you still see on this landscape that has to be addressed?
No, it's a really interesting question, and I think that we hear quite often, especially when it comes to from a public perspective, at the government level, is around free trade agreements, and in terms of again, going back to procurement and preferent as quite often gets misconstrued as preferential treatment to diverse owned businesses, and free trade agreements might prevent that, but that's not the case. And we've seen models, inclusive procurement models, work extremely well in the US and here in Canada. If you look at cities like Toronto, who've done a great job of implementing social procurement policies. And so I think that it's very much around it's around having internal policies and practices. It's around changing kind of the mindset of how we are doing business. And we need to shift away from how we've always done business and think about how can we improve? How can we improve how we're doing things? Not only for our own bottom line, but to create the impact within the communities in which we operate and live. And we know that, again, by helping to economically empower, whether it's, again, the LGBT business community or any other diverse community, we know that is helping to create that social change that's so critical for many of these marginalized community groups.
Yeah. Last question. When you hold your conference and you hear from the membership about what what its experiences are, and obviously there's also a whole lot of regular mundane things that the chambers of commerce end up doing. But I wonder if you have been able to identify, as a result of your conference, a couple of clear priorities for the next year, particularly in this environment we're in right now, where we are having some of these conversations and where the window might be a little more open to having these things.
Yeah, you're right. The chambers do some of that mundane stuff, and so certainly, we're talking about.
Yeah, I've been to a few Chamber of Commerce meetings. Don't worry.
So
they don't keep me awake at times.
But what's important, and why we do this conference, there's a few reasons. And so certainly we have the content that is it's about general business things, whether it's like marketing, social media, financing, that sort of stuff that is helping our businesses grow and succeed, which is important. But for me, it is very much around those conversations that are helping to advance and remove some of these barriers that we've talked about. And so when we hear from senior leaders at RBC, for instance, and talking about what it means to be a powerful and inclusive leader. That is what I think we need to be hearing from it, or these leaders that are stepping out. They are realizing the impact that they can create and their businesses can create by drawing greater attention and awareness to the power and the importance that the LGBT business community can bring, again, to not only to our local communities, but to our national economy overall. So I think it's very much about, trying to share those stories and get that message out there.
Yeah. Well, I still found the study rather troubling, but it sounds as if there are a lot of hands applied to try to get things going and make things better. Last question: what would you say happened in terms of the progression, or not, during the pandemic?
Yeah. So our businesses, as you can imagine, again, as a Chamber of Commerce, we represent all businesses of all sizes, of all industries across the country. And so many of our businesses, had done very well. They were able to either pivot, adapt, kind of weather the storm. But like the rest of, kind of small businesses, we did have some that suffered and closed. And there's been lots of research that's come out that's shown that at the end of the day, it was the diverse-owned businesses that kind of were hardest impacted through this. And we have an understanding of why that is for the LGBT businesses, quickly, in terms of the fact that they tend to skew a little bit smaller and a little bit younger. So, they don't necessarily have the large reserves to kind of weather this, what we never dreamt would be, 18 months or whatever we're going into now. There's some of those reasons for sure. But, I think that what has continued to amaze me, though, is at the end of the day, it's the resiliency of our community. And, I talked about how early on, how kind of the LGBT community really came together to support each other. And I think that's what I've really seen a lot over this pandemic and throughout this week at our summit, is how our community is just coming together and supporting one another. And it's not only our LGBT business community, but it's our community at large. I was saying that I want corporations and governments to do more, but don't get me wrong, is that they are doing a lot. And our corporate partners, they showed up. They're showing up this week. Our government partners are showing up this week because they understand and they want to be part of this change. And so I'm optimistic. I think that yes, this pandemic has been hard, and it's been hard on all Canadian businesses. But I just feel that our LGBT plus businesses are strong. They're resilient, and part of our theme is unstoppable, and I truly believe our businesses are unstoppable. And I'm hoping that what will come out of the summit in a little bit is just creating those added connections, those added support, and just hopefully a little bit of motivation. So we're not all walking away and troubled by this research, but see it as a challenge for all of us to say, we need to change this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good resting place for the conversation. It's been really good. I'm very happy to have you have met you and brought you on our podcast. Thanks a lot for your help today, Darrell.
No, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on here. Thank you.
Yeah. Darrell Schuurman is the CEO and co-founder of Canada's LGBT plus Chamber of Commerce. You've been watching BIV Today. I'm Kirk LaPointe. Thanks a lot for watching.